Hello everybody, my name is Cara and my channel is Wild Book Garden, and I'm really excited to be here for my first Literary Gladiators guest video. And today the topic is going to be kind of a middle grade book starter kit. I'm going to be giving some recommendations for people who either think middle grade books aren't for them, or they don't know where to start with middle grade, or they kind of just want a lot of recommendations from different kinds of middle grade, like different genres, all in one place. So I think this should be a video that can apply to a lot of different people, and I'm really passionate about the importance of people reading across all different age ranges. That's something that's just really important to me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some books that are technically in the middle grade age range, but that I think adults would get a lot out of as well. These are all going to be books that I really love and really recommend, and also books that I think break stereotypes of what people think middle grade books are in various ways. Like they don't measure up to kind of the generic idea that some people have of middle grade, because I think that the way that publishing focuses so much on age range, I think does people a disservice, because they end up thinking that books that follow kids as main characters, or books that are targeted at a middle grade audience, couldn't ever be for them, or they couldn't enjoy them or get something out of them, and that's just not true. Oh, and I should mention that because this video is going up in March, the timing is perfect if you are wanting to participate in middle grade March, or maybe you've never participated but you're kind of curious. Like if you're interested in middle grade but you're not sure how to jump in, it's a pretty good time to do it. So I'm going to start with a couple of sort of introductory texts, if you will, to kind of explain why I think this even matters, why you should care. And one of them is this very short book. It's like just an essay that is called Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You Are So Old and Wise. And this is by Catherine Rundell. I know that the availability of the physical copy can vary a little bit, but you can get it like on ebook, or I think through libraries and things. And this is just, I love this. This really summarizes, I think, what makes children's literature so special and so important, for kids obviously, but for adults as well. This is a book that I think really everybody could benefit from. If you're already a lover of middle grade books, I think this will mean a lot to you. But if you're skeptical, I think you should read this as well. Like if you're an adult reader who doesn't think they could enjoy books that follow kids, who think they might be too young or immature for them, I would really recommend this book for you as well, just for anybody. I think it does a really great job of summarizing in this really beautiful language, really clever language. Catherine Rundell is just a really brilliant writer. I think she does a great job of communicating why we should care, why we should read children's books, and why that's important. So I really recommend that. And then one that I think is a little less universally recommendable, but I still really loved it and I would recommend it, is a nonfiction book that has kind of a similar idea in some ways, and that is Steeped in Stories by Macaulay Perkins, Timeless Children's Novels to Refresh Our Tired Souls. Now this book is a little bit longer, and it is specifically talking about 7 different classic children's books. And one of the things that Macaulay Perkins does at the beginning is she talks about why we should even read children's books at all, which is obviously very in line with this video. And she also talks about the importance of rereading, which is something I also think is important. And throughout the book, she does a really phenomenal job of talking about some of these older books that in some ways were ahead of their time and in other ways really weren't. And how do you balance those things? Like how do you look at the good of a story, whether or not it's an old story, and then also look at the bad and be honest about that. So I think that's really great as well. It does have a religious element, so if that's not something that you want, then just keep that in mind, because she does pair each book she talks about with one of the 7 heavenly virtues. That's kind of how she structures the book. So again, just keep that in mind, but if this is something that you would be interested in, I thought it was fantastically done. Now I'm going to get into the actual middle grade books that I want to recommend, and again, these are a wide variety of genres, and all of these books in some way or another, often in multiple ways, go against what somebody's preconception about middle grade books might be. So the first one I have is I Can Make This Promise by Christine Day. This is a contemporary book following a young girl who is Native American, but she doesn't really know that much about her family. Her mother is also Native American, but she was adopted into a white family, and so our main character, Edie, doesn't really know a lot about her mother's family and about her tribal heritage and all of this. And one day she is going through things in the attic and she finds a photograph of a young woman who looks exactly like Edie. And this kind of ends up setting her on this journey to find out more about her family and her past. And the reason I picked this book is because I think this book deals with some really difficult ideas and issues that people who aren't familiar with middle grade books might not expect it to. It deals with generational trauma. Definitely look into a complete list of content warnings if you need to, especially things related to children and families. And it talks about these these things that happened and are continuing to happen to Native families and kids, and it does it in a way that is appropriate for the audience, but that is still really thoughtful, that doesn't sugarcoat, that again, adult readers could get something out of. And one thing that I really love about this book too is that it balances these really big problems with the more personal problems that Edie is going through. Like, she's having a really difficult friendship situation, and I think the way that Christine Day shows that while also showing these really big things that Edie is struggling with is just so respectful and compassionate, and it recognizes that just because Edie has these big problems that are happening, it doesn't mean that the more personal problems or the, like, quote unquote smaller problems don't matter. And I just think that's a really fantastic thing about middle grade books in general, or just books in general. I also have a really interesting combination of genres or kinds of books, and that is Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. Like, look at all these award stickers. Obviously, many people know and love this book. I think this is such an interesting combination of things, because this is a memoir that is told in verse and that is intended for a middle grade audience. And I think those are things that don't often go together, or people don't think they go together, but this is beautifully written. Jacqueline Woodson talks about obviously her childhood, what it was like growing up in the 60s, and kind of her experiences associated with that, being a Black girl, but also just being a kid. And I think that her writing is just lovely. Like, there is a simplicity to it that is deceptive, because her writing is not plain. It's just very concise, it's very intentional. Like, I think one of the strengths of good poetry is that it doesn't waste words, and Jacqueline Woodson doesn't, but she still uses the exact right words. It's still beautiful. There's still this wonderful rhythm to her writing, and I really, really love this. I think especially people don't think of nonfiction as being something for middle grade audiences, or maybe adult readers who read nonfiction don't think middle grade nonfiction could offer them anything, but that's not true. I think this is a really fantastic memoir, and I think you can tell from reading it why this combination, like a middle grade memoir told in verse, was such a perfect combination for this book, and I just really love that one. I also have a fantasy to recommend. I have a couple actually. This is Witchwood by Tara Amafi. Now, this is the companion sequel to Furthermore, which is a very, very loose Alice in Wonderland retelling, and I really like that one as well. But that one I think is maybe more expected in terms of what people think middle grade books are, because it's very whimsical. It has this very particular kind of whimsy that I think people tend to associate with books for children, which is not a bad thing, but I wanted to highlight a book that I think does things differently. And also, you can read these out of order if you would like to. And this is a Persian-inspired fantasy story. Our main character is a girl named Layli, who her and her family, their job is to prepare the bodies of the dead. And she's now the only one left who does that, and the villagers are starting to take advantage of that. They're not paying her anymore because they know that she has to do this. And it's a really, really lonely life. And then she ends up meeting some characters that we met from Furthermore, and it's about, this is a book that's about like grief and healing and loneliness and finding friendship with people, and it's also quite dark in places. Like, this is a very atmospheric book, but it's also a book that deals, again, with a lot of heavy ideas, which many middle grade books do. I just think the writing of this is really beautiful as well. I think the characters are really heartfelt, and I think the creepiness also might be something people don't expect from middle grade books. And when I say people, I mean like in general. Obviously, not everybody makes the same assumptions about middle grade, but yeah, I just really would recommend this one, and it's definitely a very different tone from Furthermore. So if you read Furthermore and you weren't convinced, you might still give this one a try. Next, I had to pick a book by one of my favorite authors, and that is Gullstruck Island by Frances Hardinge. I love Frances Hardinge, and I think her basically entire body of work could be a counter argument to the idea that all middle grade is the same, or that middle grade books can't do serious things, because she always tackles really, really important ideas in her books. And this book is one of my favorites from her, and the US title, you might see it called The Lost Conspiracy, depending on the edition you find. I do not like the US titles. Mine is the UK one, and this is just such a phenomenal fantasy book. Like, I say this every time I talk about this book, but I really do mean it, is like, personal taste is always going to play a factor, like play a role in what people think about a book. But in terms of the craftsmanship, I feel like you, like, as objective as you can be about something like reading, this is objectively a fantastically put together book. Like, everything about it is done so well. We follow our main character Hathin, and she lives on this island where there are very, very few people on it who are called lost. and what Lost can do is send their senses outside of their bodies. And right at the beginning of the book, something terrible happens where all of the Lost except one die. The only Lost person who doesn't is Hathin's sister Arilu. And so there's kind of this murder mystery element to the book. And then also Hathin, she ends up teaming up with some other people and getting involved in a revenge quest. This book is really, really brutal in places like this is another one that has quite a few content warnings, but like things like genocide and murder and just the things that Hathin goes through, and then that she still has this sense of compassion and kindness and mercy is really, really incredible. And she's one of my favorite main characters I've ever read. She's kind of that quintessential, like, ordinary person who ends up doing great things because they have a conscience and they care about the world, and I just really admire her so much. The writing is fantastic. Frances Hardinge has this way of describing things in ways that you wouldn't think of, but that make perfect sense, and she also doesn't overload you with descriptions. I think the setting and the world building is phenomenal. Like, she clearly has thought through exactly what this world looks like and how it operates. The attention to detail is incredible, like the way these different like groups of people interact, because Hathin and the majority of the main characters are from the Lace tribe, and we see the history of the Lace and the colonizers who've come to this island and how they interact with each other. And it's just such a thoughtful book, and the things that this book says about revenge versus forgiveness and like justice and mercy and like suffering and responsibility, like there's just so much that this book talks about, in addition to being just an incredibly compelling story. So I highly recommend this one. Again, this is one that I think is really, really complex, which people don't always think middle grade books can be, and it deals with some really heavy ideas as well. Okay, and then speaking of really heavy ideas, I have Mauricio by Mauricio translated by A.A. Prime, and this is a really interesting series. This is the first book in a series of companion novels, and I feel like this book, I'm not great at age ranges, like differentiating them, but I feel like this one could be somewhere between middle grade and young adult. The second book is definitely adult, and then the third book is kind of between young adult and adult. And I think that's another thing, is people don't always think of a book series as spanning multiple age ranges. People think of it as a very like hard and fast rule, and that's not the case. And so in this book we follow our main character Mauricio, who lives in the Red Abbey. The series is called the Red Abbey Chronicles, and this is a sanctuary for girls and women who are fleeing hardship, often of the kind that is inflicted by men. And so it's this community of women who are safe together. And one day a young girl comes here who Mauricio ends up making friends with, but soon some people from this girl's past end up coming to the island and trying to bring her back very violently. And it's about what this means for the Abbey and for this safety and for this sanctuary. And like I was saying, this book does have some really difficult topics it deals with. Like, it talks about the kinds of things that these girls are escaping from. Like, you see references to things, there's some things that happen that are technically off page, but they're very much a part of the book that are really difficult to read about, things like sexual violence, and this book really doesn't pull its punches. Like, the second book is much, much darker than this one, but even in this one, you really get this sense of what is at stake here. But just in terms of what I love about this book, besides its ability to handle these dark ideas, the female friendship here is fantastic. I think the setting and the world and the like different like belief systems and how those work is all just so interesting and so well written. I think as a series, like the trilogy as a whole, I think is like really fascinating in the way it all fits together really well, but each book also has a different kind of focus. Like, I just would really recommend this series overall, and Mauricio is the first one, and also the only one that I think you could make the argument could be in middle grade / crossing into young adult. You're probably noticing that a lot of these fit into the handle really dark ideas category, and that's because that's one of the things I find really frustrating about like people who look down on middle grade books. It's like, I know part of the problem is the way that we market books, but it's like when people say that kids' books are always happy, it's like, have you read any in the last few years? Like, it just, a lot of them deal with really heavy things. And one of those is The Dollmaker of Krakow by R.M. Romero. This is a World War II historical fantasy, so all content warnings associated with that. This is one of the books that, even though I read a lot of middle grade, and I read a lot of middle grade that deals with difficult things, I was still surprised at how far this book went. So again, check content warnings for this one for sure, but it has a little bit of like a nutcracker element to it, but it is mostly a World War II historical fiction book, and we are following a doll as the main character. And we see parallels between the magical world, like the war that she has left in her magical kingdom she's from, with the like real world situation going on, like with World War II. And I think that is done in a way that is very thoughtful. I think sometimes it's tricky to add a fantastical element to real world conflicts without like kind of cheapening those things. But I think this book did a really good job with it. And we see this doll kind of be adopted almost by this doll maker, and we see both of them start to make friends with people in the city, and we also see what it's like as the rising anti-Semitism starts taking away the people that they care about. Like they make friends with a young Jewish girl, and we see what happens to her and her family. And again, this is one that really goes there. Like, it doesn't soften the realities of what happened. Like, yes, it is intended for a younger audience, but that doesn't mean that they lie to kids, you know, about what things were like. So I think this book balanced those things really well. And if you're a historical fiction lover who maybe is not sure where to start with middle grade, this might be a good one to pick. I realize I haven't been being consistent about like mentioning genres. Mauricio is also a fantasy, and I think the other ones I think I actually covered. And then another historical fiction that I wanted to talk about is Soul Lanterns by Shaw Kuski, and this is translated by Emily Balistrieri. And this book is set, I think, 20 years after the United States bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And it is set on the island of Hiroshima. And this is kind of in that same category. Like I said this in the wrap-up where I talk about this book, that even as somebody who reads and loves middle grade, and who reads a lot of middle grade books that deal with very difficult subjects, I was still surprised at how specific this book was. Because we're following these three young kids as our main characters, and they are given a school assignment to, it's called Hiroshima Then and Now, and these kids end up going to talk to their neighbors and friends and strangers about what they went through during the bombing, about how they lost people, about what it was like, and even this, like, the little details throughout this book about what it is like to live in the aftermath of something like that. Like the fact that they, like just the image of having a cemetery that is completely filled with tombstones where the death date is all the same, like those images are just communicated so well, so clearly. And so as these kids interview these people, they start getting a more immediate sense of what it's like, of like the history of Hiroshima, because obviously they've grown up here and they know about these things that happened, but now they hear people's personal stories. So that is a really big element of the book. And then also kind of arguably our main character is a girl who, she's with her mother at the like lantern ceremony where they release lanterns once a year to commemorate the people who died in the bombings. And she notices one time that her mother releases a lantern that she doesn't know who it's for. And this kind of sets her off on this journey to learn more about her family, and like her family history. And like this book deals with a lot of really dark things. There's a lot of loss and grief and trauma. Again, I mentioned that it is very specific. Like this book is very specific about some of the horrible ways that people died and that people lost loved ones, and it is like really brutal to read in a lot of parts, but I really think this is an important one to read, especially if you are from the US. And I think the ultimate message is about how important peace is. And I just think all of that comes together really beautifully in this book. Again, it's a hard one to read. Make sure you're in a good headspace for it. But if you can read this one, I would highly, highly recommend it. I do want to mention that some people did not like how simplistic the writing style is. And I kind of hesitated to put this one on that list because I think that's a stereotype people have, is that middle grade is like the writing is very simple, and that specifically it is simple and that that's a bad thing. That's an indicator of poor quality. And I don't think that's true. I think you can tell from this book that the very spare writing style was a very particular choice for how immediate the story was and the kind of story it was. And I also think the assumption that the more descriptive or flowery a writing style is, the better the quality of the book is. I think that assumption is also really weird. So I do want to mention that if you really, really don't like plain writing style, be prepared for that in this one, but I think it's a really incredible book. And then finally, the last book I have to recommend is Amber and Clay by Laura Amy Schlitz with illustrations by Julia Iredale. This is another historical fiction, and this is a novel in verse that is set in ancient Greece. And we're following two main characters. One of them is a young girl named Mellisto, who is from a really well-off family, and the other is a young boy named Roscos, who is a slave. And they obviously have very different situations in life, but the book is about their lives, what they go through, and their eventual meeting and friendship. And this is one of my favorite books I read last year. Like, I think this just is one of the most incredible stories I've read recently. I think the way that Laura Amy Schlitz uses like archaeological sources is so smart. Like, this is kind of, it's not it's a little bit of a mixed media book, I guess, because you have some sections that are told in verse, one of which is actually one of the main narrators, who is Hermes, the Greek god, and I love the way that she wrote him because she clearly is paying attention to the way Hermes was characterized in Greek stories while also kind of putting her own spin on him, and I feel like you can tell in the way that he's written that he's not human, but also that he's maybe a little more human than he thinks he is. And I love the way he's characterized. I love the way that Melito and Roscos are written. I just am so invested in these characters when I read this book. And like I was saying, it is a little bit of a mixed media because you have the verse and the prose sections, but you also have throughout the book these different archaeological artifacts that Laura Amy Schlitz interprets to add to the story. And it sounds like those things wouldn't all work together, but I promise they do. And like the setting is so well done. The writing itself is just wonderful. Like it's so emotional and evocative, and while also having this really like important historical grounding. I think the character work is fantastic. I think the development of the friendship between Melito and Roscos is fantastic, especially considering how long it is into the book before they meet. Like, I think that's a hard thing to pull off, but I think the author did a great job with it because you know these characters individually so well that when they finally meet, you understand immediately why they would have this connection and why they would mean so much to each other. Like just the emotional investment and payoff in this book is phenomenal. I also think it does a really great job of talking about the realities of this time period without like excusing things that were happening at the time. This is another one that deals a lot with really important themes like grief and loss and suffering and friendship and different kinds of love. Like it just a phenomenal book. This is another book that just the craftsmanship of it is just so impressive to me. So I think if somebody is like, you know, I don't know if middle grade is for me because I just don't know if it's up to my standards, it's like, this is a great, I think, counterexample to that. I think this book is just written so well. So that was my very long gush about some different middle grade books I love. I covered a lot of different genres, and like I said, all of these books in some way or another I think break stereotypes people might have about middle grade. So I hope that if you're already a middle grade lover, here are some books to check out. If you're skeptical, here are some that might win you over, and I just really hope that you found at least one book that sounds interesting to you. And I should have mentioned to you that the most important thing when you're trying to get into any kind of book is to listen to what you're interested in, which sounds very basic, but it's like if you want to pick up a middle grade book and enjoy it, don't necessarily go by what everyone says the best middle grade book is, even though I'm kind of doing that in this video. Like, go by things that you're interested in. Like, if you really like stories set in ancient Greece, like maybe read Amber and Clay rather than whatever is the most popular middle grade book at the moment. So I hope you guys found something or several somethings to check out. Obviously I love all of these books. I think they're all great selections, and I hope that you were able to find some that spoke to your interests. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!